This is a Grade 5, Mission 5 overview for Zearn Math. If you're using Eureka materials, it's the Module 5 overview. Title is Volume, Area, and Shapes. This is a medium priority mission, which means you get through it. If you need to buy time for other missions, this is where you do it. If you need to spend time individualizing some instruction or differentiating some instruction with foundational skills with certain students, this is a time when you should be able to find some time to do that. The central focus of this is geometry, understanding and finding volume, finding area with fractional side lengths, and classifying polygons. The nice thing about geometry is there are students who can do it, who can do well with geometry, who don't necessarily do well with other aspects of math. So you don't want to skip these items, and they do come up later, but they don't have to be taught as explicitly as you've done some of the other instructions. So you could actually skip more lessons, use alternative approaches to teach some of this, especially in years like the pandemic year, where we have less physical time to spend with kids. There are other ways you might be able to do this just as well, and we'll talk about some of those. Progression starts with exploration of volume with prisms using cubes, and works on the expansion of two-dimensional thinking into three-dimensional thinking, which is where volume comes in. They calculate by length, width, and height, so moving into the formula, and then eventually computing volume without cubes, so just taking the length of the lengths of each sides and multiplying those together. Volume is not a difficult concept for students to retain, especially of basic figures. Now they move into composite figures, and that gets a little dicier. I wouldn't worry about mastery of composite figures at this point. They are really good. I would give kids problems just to see how they can do and have them work through them in groups, and really, because it takes it really to a higher depth of knowledge, level 3 and 4. If you just turn it over to kids with prior knowledge of calculating area of individual figures, if they can figure out these composite ones, then just a nice problem-solving event that can help them feel successful and good about math. Moves into the area of a rectangle with fractional side lengths, so we're back to 2 dimensions. Get to practice some fraction multiplication. Might even cleverly throw in some perimeter, so they have to add some fractions there. Uses an area model and eventually moves into the standard algorithm. And then at the end, you're working on analysis and classification of shapes, specifically quadrilaterals, parallelograms, squares, rectangles, rhombuses, and trapezoids would be the figures you're working on. Prerequisite skill fluency practice. There's not a lot in here other than fraction operations for the multiplication of, for the area of rectangles with fractional side lengths. Continue to work on adding and subtracting fractions, making equivalent fractions, both with like and unlike denominators. The core fluency is multiplying fractions and decimals, because that'll come up in some of the problems. And then finding volume, which is just multiplication. The foundational goal is calculating volume using the formula. I think that's the most important aspect coming out of this mission moving forward. If they can do this, then they're going to be money ahead. Honestly, if they don't get this, it's going to be revisited in the middle school years, so they'll get another chance. What doesn't go away? Again, these are just the skills that you have to continue to work on in math, regardless of whether you feel students have mastered them or not. So multiple digit fluencies from prior grades, all of them, all 4. Fractions, we've now learned to add and subtract with like and unlike denominators. Continue to throw problems at them. We've now learned to multiply fractions, and we've learned to divide fractions by whole numbers and whole numbers by fractions. And then, of course, on occasion, revisit all single-digit fact fluencies. Again, when you're working on fluencies, we're not talking about several minutes a day. We're talking about a few minutes a day where you throw a few random problems at students. They should already know it, so they should be able to do anything fluently. The point of repeating this is just to make sure they stay fresh in long-term memory, readily achievable. As students, when we move away from content and students don't practice it, it has a tendency to deteriorate in long-term memory, and it takes longer to retrieve if they don't forget it completely, and it is possible to forget it completely. So it's worth revisiting these skills often at a procedural level. Of course, we hope they have conceptual understanding, but in the few minutes, you're just looking at procedural skill. Special notes for this mission for kids. So you're probably going to be running out of time. You're probably going to need to limit time here. Topics A and B volume could be covered without going through all the lessons if you're running low on time. You could do a few activities with these and throw some problems at them and probably cover this quite quickly in a matter of 2 or 3 days. Topic C, area, could be, they've already covered area, so rather than teach a lesson conceptually, you could just give them problems. You could give them area problems with a rectangle, with fractions, and just remind them of how you calculate the area of a rectangle and let them do them. Topic D, it may be worth covering these lessons, and I'm going to have to go back in and see why it's worth covering those lessons. It's really exploring four-dimensional, so quadrilaterals, so four-sided figures, four-sided polynomials. But I would kind of go back on that. Rather than covering the lessons, you could just expose them to those materials. You could have the pictures of the figures on the wall with their names so that students are looking at them all the time, and then just have problem-solving activities where you ask students to compare and contrast the different figures. What makes one different from the other? They could use terminology like parallel lines. They could compare the angles. Some have right angles, some don't. Little things like that. Just talk about them. So those lessons could be covered too in a relatively short amount of time if you needed to. This might be a fun place. Anytime there's figures or geometry, it might be a fun place to include the art teacher to play along with you and have a little math fun.